this meeting of the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors back to order. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Yes, Supervisors Frost. Here. Natoli.
Here.
Peters.
Here.
Cerna.
Here.
Kennedy.
Here.
And you have a quorum. So your first item, you held this item from the consent calendars this morning, item number 9. It's the modification of recorded final maps or parcel maps.
Good afternoon. I'm Surinder Singh, Principal Planner with the Office of Planning and Environmental Review. Project requiring condition change will be brought back to the original approving body. That is the plan. And this is something that we'll be clarifying as part of our next zoning code update fix-it package.
Okay. So if I could, Mr. So surrender and will it be a notice requirement to that, or it would just go back to the hearing body? So if it was heard at the planning commission or board, or I guess project review committee, it would just go back there as a staff presented item, or would there be some notice requirements? Is there an application fee, or how does all that work?
I think the intent is to follow the standard procedure that we have in place right now.
Okay.
Right, the state law requires a notice, and I think that's also in the ordinance.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So, but it's streamlined from what the initial process is. Obviously, the initial process for, I don't mean this process, but no, it's not?
I'm not sure. It requires a public hearing and notice. John and Surinder may have an idea whether that would be more streamlined, but it does require the formal requirements that a map would.
And I guess what is currently in place? You have to go back and submit a whole new map and everything? Is that what's...
Right now, there is nothing in the county code that allows amendment of a final map unless there's a list in the Subdivision Map Act of basically like ministerial corrections that
Okay.
John Scarpa would have the ability to do through a certificate of correction, but the county never enabled the statute that allows other types of corrections. So this is what it's doing, and it's been state law for a number of years. We just never put it in
Yeah,
our
well, I think it
code.
makes sense. I just, again, it wasn't enough in here, and I think both you and Surinder provided, information certainly clarifies it for me, so I'm...
And we'll
prepared to-
clarify that as part of our next fix-it package.
Okay. And I would move to item, Mr. Chair, unless there's anybody else to speak to it.
Second. Please vote.
Unanimous vote.
25.
Item 25 is consider the installation of a speed table on River Road.
Good afternoon. Reza Mugisi, Department of Transportation. The item before you relates to installation of a speed table on River Road in Walnut Grove. In recent years, business owners as well as residents on River Road have expressed concerns about speeding and traffic safety on River Road in Walnut Grove. In response, staff has engaged businesses as well as residents to develop a traffic plan to address their concerns. Initially, the plan focused on some striping and signing in order to raise awareness among motorists that use that facility and go through Walnut Grove community. However, because the speeding problem continued, we had to resort to more restrictive measures. I have a few overhead display to help me with my presentation. River Road is a levee road that runs adjacent to the Sacramento River. It serves approximately 7,000 vehicles a day. Some of those vehicles come from or go to the Bay Area, and due to farming and agricultural industry in the Delta, a good portion of truck traffic or trucks use River Road to get to I-5 or other destination. In Walnut Grove, River Road serves as Main Street in the business district. It provides access to the river for fishing and boating. And because of that, as well as because of the fronting retail business, You see quite a bit of pedestrian activity along River Road in Walnut Grove. There are no sidewalks on River Road, and the road also accommodates parking. The speed zone within this area is posted for 25 miles per hour. This plan depicts the measures, actions we have taken. As you can see on the left side are those measures that involved mostly striping or signing. For example, we installed a double yellow center line to restrict passing within the Walnut Grove business district. We restriped the crosswalk in front of the post office and restricted parking in that area to allow greater visibility for pedestrians that cross River Road. Also, at C Street, which is a three-way stop right now, we changed the width of the limit line to 24 inches, and
It's locking up on me.
you can't see that from there. And refresh the existing limit line and pavement legends. Also, we installed southbound advanced warning signs and legend approximately 80 feet south of A Street. In addition to these striping and signings, we also installed flashing beacon on the existing three-way stop control to, again, increase visibility for drivers that approach that intersection so that they can make a full stop before proceeding. Also, we installed new street lighting at that intersection, again, to increase visibility at night. Then there are a few other measures that are shown here in red. After those signing and striping didn't do the job that we were hoping for, about 2 years ago, we submitted an application to Central Valley Flood Protection Board to allow us to install two speed feedback signs, one for southbound traffic and one for northbound traffic approaching downtown. And also in front of the post office, we have a crosswalk that we wanted to increase the visibility there, and we're proposed to put a street light with an overhead mast arm to put a pedestrian symbol. The reason for submitting that application is that we cannot dig into the levee road because of the restriction imposed on it, and that application had to be submitted. The Central Valley Protection Board had to forward the application to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and that is where our application has remained for nearly 2 years. We just recently heard that the application has been approved, and we should soon receive a permit to install the two speed feedback signs as well as the street light in front of the post office with a mast arm and a pedestrian sign to again provide greater visibility for approaching vehicles. But having done, having taken those steps, it is not certain whether these improvements will really address the speeding problem that everyone has been quite concerned about. So in discussing the concern with the, again, residents and the business community there, the idea of putting a speed table on River Road was presented, and after evaluating that, we came to the conclusion that given the persistence of the speeding problem, perhaps we can use that as a pilot installation for 6 to 9 months to see how well it can control the speeding, at least within this block of River Road. The concern for the speed table has always been the agricultural truck traffic that have to use this road, and with the speed table, it may pose a problem for them. We felt that if we put that in place, we can more fully assess the suitability of this device and then decide whether to keep it in place or to remove it. Now, as you can see, the location for this speed table is very desirable because there are 2 intersections on each side of the proposed speed table. That's C Street and is the Walnut Grove Bridge. Each of those intersections have an always stop control, and that means that the concern that we have always had for higher speeds at night, fog condition, and that would pose a safety concern may not be as valid here because traffic has to stop about 200-300 feet in advance of that speed table.
If I could pause you there,
Sure.
Supervisor Natoli.
Yeah, I'll wait at least that, Mr. Chair. That's fine, thanks.
Sure.
Yeah.
And in addition to the proposed speed table, which we are requesting your approval for as a pilot installation, we are also working with the residents and business community within the community of Locke. They have expressed the same type of concerns with respect to speeding on River Road adjacent to their community. We are currently evaluating that request. We are not quite sure that the majority of people are in support of such device, but we are in the process of making that assessment, and once if we determine there is enough support for an always stop, we will bring that back to your board for approval. Now, it's important to note that Locke and Walnut Grove, these 2 communities are less than 2,000 feet apart, and if we were to install an always stop there, it would kind of fit into the traffic pattern from Walnut Grove to north of Locke. I think that concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Supervisor Natoli.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Reza, and I want to, before I make a few comments and pose just a couple of questions, that I want to thank our staff, certainly Reza, Lupe, Lou, and others who've been working on this. We've been working with the community for several years and actually had a community meeting, well attended, about 100 folks in late October, and then I actually shared a meeting with Sheriff Jones as a result of the meeting, first meeting, where there were some community safety concerns that came up. And Sheriff Jones and his staff were there to talk about a variety of other issues related to law enforcement. And it wasn't very long before the focus came right back to traffic safety, and what are we going to do? And I would just say that the issue is compounded by a couple different factors. One being the parallel highway, depending upon which side of the river and where you are, upstream or downstream, is Highway 160, and it carries a good deal of traffic. But in this case, obviously we have the control here. Working with Caltrans, it can be a challenge at times relative to speeds through some of the Delta towns and any controls at intersection or bridges and so forth. But I would just note that it's in the report, but I want to highlight it because 7,000 cars a day through Walnut Grove is a significant number of cars. There's local traffic, obviously, related to agriculture, to local business, to recreation, and just people's daily trips up and down the river and through their communities. But the erratic behavior, the fatal accidents, we had fatalities to the south on Walnut Grove Thornton Road last year. We've had fatal accidents, and again, not where people went into the river, but there were either head-ons or significant collisions in areas that are posted 35 and 25, no passing zones. And what we did here the evening, and Reza was there, and I know he and his staff took some notes, was that the erratic behavior is not just speeding or high volumes, but we're seeing folks on pretty treacherous conditions just in normal course of things where you have narrow two-lane roads on levees and or deep shoulders, folks passing school buses, basically going in and around farm equipment that is moved from time to time, and just really, posing a threat to themselves and to others. And again, I don't attribute that all to pass-through traffic from areas outside the Delta, but nonetheless, this is an effort in working with our staff and with the community, the business community, the front-on businesses, homeowners and merchants, but also we had representatives from agriculture there, folks that operate trucks and so forth, and certainly they acknowledged concerns, but I think they also shared the safety aspects because whether it's through downtown Walnut Grove or out on the open road along the levees or whatever, they're seeing similar conflicts in situations. And again, we're not going to have this being a pilot, certainly have speed tables up and down the river road everywhere, but we've called upon the High Patrol to assist us. They're spread thin. The sheriff has been cooperating, actually having some unmanned or assigned personnel, but just putting cars at locations to try to get people's attention. If nothing else, makes them look twice before they continue to do whatever they're going to do, is exceeding speed limit or whatever. And so we're attempting a number of things, and this is a measure to see if we can control this. And oddly enough, it looks like a fairly short stretch there. You have a public dock. We actually had a pedestrian hit 2 years ago right at the crosswalk in the lower right-hand portion, just in front of that stop sign. The pedestrian was not killed, but it was an injury. And you would think you couldn't get much head of steam in here. Rez and I were out there with one of the business owners, and the day we observed, I forget if it was a Friday afternoon or whatever, but people, they make the turn at the bridge, and next thing you know, they're going as fast as they can go to get to the next stop sign, and they gain maybe a half a second and end up, having to stop if they do stop. And so, all that being said, I'm certainly supportive of taking this, approach to see if it works. Again, we'll get a report on it. Obviously, it's not without some investment on behalf of the county, but I know that the folks have been clamoring for some other measures, enforcement being part of that, and we've reached out and gotten some attention to that. But I'm hopeful this will make for a safer, location in the downtown Walnut Grove and in the business district there, and it may provide us good data for what we can do in the future. So that's my comments. Thanks.
Okay, any other? Supervisor Serna.
Thank you. So I assume that's a motion. I'll second the motion if it is. Sure. I just had a question about the use of this particular speed calming or speed management implement when it comes to a roadway that is immediately adjacent to water and that's elevated. In other words, do we take is there special consideration for a situation like this so as not to launch vehicles?
Right.
When it's that close to a pretty steep drop off, and of course the delta of the river.
Yeah, I think that the speed zone within the area we're looking at is 25 miles per hour, but that is not the only thing we're looking at. The two intersections, north and south of the proposed speed table, have stop control. That means cars must stop before they proceed and get to this the speed table. Thirdly, speed table is more forgiving with respect to it's, cars that go over it. It has about a flat top of 10 feet and 6 feet on each side, ramping up and ramping down. So overall, we think this measure is safe, and that would not be a real concern. Now, if it was in another rural area or on Levy Road, it would certainly be a real concern.
But it's mostly due to the fact that there's limited space to accelerate, it sounds like.
Exactly, yes. The distance is so short that they won't be able to gain a speed to the point that, getting launch off to the river or something.
Thank you.
All right.
Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the second, can I ask you one other question, Reza, on this? Because I think it may affect other communities as well,
Yes.
not just in the river. Part of the identified issue here has been, obviously, modern application of people's wayfinding, and the fact that folks get directed through rural areas, through neighborhoods and suburban areas and such. I don't know if we can maybe do some analysis or nothing else. I'd like to prepare some communication to the parties. I understand maybe Google and Waze, maybe there's others that would take this into account, but the other communities have appealed, particularly in situations where it's causing safety and or other concerns. And it might be that there are other neighborhoods in this county where we want to call attention to that, where the diversion is changing traffic patterns. And of course, the Bay Area commute, in large part, is what we're seeing here, is that they direct them up and they're coming out the backside of Isleton. They're ending up on the backside of Grand Island in some cases. And I think people quickly learn that these are quicker than staying on I-5 or Highway 12, and then but they're still in a hurry to get to their destination. My question being is, this is something that we could maybe be working through, maybe the county executive, but through Department of Transportation, do some communication with the parties that basically govern those apps, and find out what would be appropriate requests would be, but to ask them to take that into account. And I've heard that there's ways that they can maybe adjust their wayfinding directions to accommodate communities where we're seeing either tremendous impacts, safety or otherwise. I guess that would be my request. So,
Sure.
and I don't know if that's something Nav. We chatted a little bit in a briefing yesterday.
I'll work with Mike and with Reza.
Okay, and there may be other neighborhoods. Again, we all have different parts, and so if we're seeing that, it may not only too universal in a request, but if there are, it might be wise for us to point out 2 or 3 different locations where that's occurring and causing neighborhood and or community or business impacts and or safety, particularly safety issues. That would be the emphasis here. So, okay,
Sure.
Supervisor Peters.
Yeah, thank you. I'm fine with the item. I'll vote for it. I'm just kind of curious as why this is coming back to us today. It looks like it was approved in the 18-19 budget, and other than that, shouldn't it come in the NTMP process?
Supervisor, this is not part of a traditional NTMP process. It's a unique application of a speed table in an area that we would not normally apply the NTMP tools or methodology.
Why?
It's largely because it's not a standard feature that we normally do in a under our NTMP program. That's in fact why it's being requested today that it be considered as a pilot. We've done that in a couple of other areas. We did something similar to that we brought on its own when it was, I forget the road down in the South County where we put a whole bunch of those.
Randolph.
Yeah, so when we've done some things that are a little bit non-standard with a speed control device like this, we've brought it forward separate from the NTMP program.
Well, perhaps another time you can explain to me what's non-standard about this, because we do have a process that everybody goes through. It's the petitions, it's the whole thing, and you have the neighborhood meetings like Supervisor Natoli described. So I just thought it was kind of unusual to see it called out separately.
It is in the context of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, anything else? There's a motion and a second. Please vote.
Unanimous vote.
Next item.
Item 26 is the Community Planning Advisory Council's resolution of intention, request to adopt a resolution of intention to initiate amendments to the Sacramento County Zoning Code and provide direction on amendments to the county code relating to CPACs.
Good afternoon, members of the board. Before Chris Pahuli gives the staff report, just want to give a little bit of context. There's a request that was made in the fall by Supervisor Kennedy, Supervisor Peters, for us to look at the CPACs. And what you're going to hear today from planning is that CPACs have been around since the 70s, and during that time, modifications, changes have been made, but we've not gone back in a comprehensive manner to look at what the original intent was. Is it functioning the way we want it? Do we want to make any changes? So the approach that you will see today is, rather than us going out and start making modifications, we want input from the board to make sure that what we're looking at kind of comports with what the board members have. So main purpose today is to get your comments, and if the majority of the board so will, is the will of the board, is to go back, work with all the stakeholders, and then come back with a final product to present to you. So with that, Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Nev. Good afternoon, Chair Kennedy, members of the board. I'll be providing some, I guess, supplemental remarks to what the executive just provided. As he mentioned, the item before you requests board direction to staff regarding the scope of this effort, and then to adopt a resolution to initiate zoning code amendments. As additional background, there are 13 CPACs and 1 municipal advisory council representing the various unincorporated communities in the county. County code governs these CPACs and provides for broad use of those CPACs. However, in practice, their primary function has been to provide feedback on various planning activities, including recommendations on most discretionary planning applications as required by the zoning code. Before embarking on this effort, as the CEO mentioned, staff is seeking direction from the board on the scope of the effort. Once provided, staff is prepared to work on a package of zoning and county code amendments to address 3 major topics. The first topic is the purpose and functions of CPACs. For example, should CPACs only hear planning items, or is the venue appropriate for other county matters, or for that matter, non-county matters, and if so, when? The second topic is the CPAC's timely review of planning projects. The question here is, should the CPAC review occur early to provide community feedback and input, or later in the process to allow for an informed advisory vote to hearing bodies? In practice, and based on the zoning code's user guide, staff schedules items early in the planning process to get input from the CPAC and provide for a forum for neighbors to provide input and direction on a potential application. However, as the CPAC is required to provide an advisory vote, many times the CPAC continues items so that technical studies can be completed or other matters resolved prior to them taking an action on an item. Also, the zoning code currently allows for CPACs to appeal decisions of the hearing bodies with a free appeal. Staff seeks direction on this practice, whether this practice should continue in light of other direction that you may provide today. The third topic is more administrative and would consist of reconciling the 14 CPACs operating procedures with current practices, such as having a standard set of operating guidelines, how to address a lack of a quorum, and roles of the officers. Additionally, depending on potential changes to CPAC operations, staff is envisioning to develop a training program for all CPAC members. Following board's direction today, and as the executive mentioned, staff will refine the work program and schedule outreach meetings with the CPACs and various stakeholder groups to develop a package of amendments that would be brought before the board for consideration. That completes my remarks, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Supervisor Frost.
I was a little bit surprised when I read the chapter 2.36, and as I was reading through the purpose of the CPACs, it kind of, and actually read through the whole document, there was only one place where it really talked about voting for the CPACs. And so, and it is fairly specific in what the purpose of the CPAC is, and the fact that they are to assist the Planning Commission in an advisory capacity. And so I kind of wonder, we're talking about revamping or, updating the purpose, or, taking a look at the purpose, but I wonder if we just kind of got off track a little bit and we just need to go back to basics on what's originally intended in this document for what the CPACs were supposed to do. Because I think, and I know the CPACs have a lot of pressure on them in the community. When a community doesn't want something and they converge on the CPAC, and a lot of times they'll put things off, and or the community will start making demands on a project to change the project, which causes them to want to come back later. And what this is describing is completely different than what's really happening, I think. And so I wanted to bring that up to see if that's kind of what you were thinking, and what my colleagues were thinking. And I guess that was my first question. I mean, it doesn't look like the CPAC was originally intended to vote on planning. They were intended to give feedback to assist the Planning Commission. Is that your understanding?
My understanding is that the setup originally with the CPACs is a pretty broad mandate to address a number of items, including planning items. Throughout the years, there's been a number of different types of projects or different items that have been taken to CPACs just as a sounding board or as feedback, and they've served that function. However, at least most recently, the CPAC's engagement in the planning application process is codified in our zoning code and is part of our user guide to take items to them, not discretionary, most planning discretionary applications for an advisory vote. And there's certain authorities vested to the CPACs in the code about bumping the hearing bodies if they deny a project and so forth. So my understanding is that the original intent was pretty broad, but it's been a little more focused throughout the years and to the point that we are now.
So one of the reasons why we are in front of you on that component is there's not a clear path for us on this, is that sometimes they are taking votes, sometimes they're not. What's the meaning of the vote? Is it advisory? Is it binding? Where does that go? And our practice has become, when we bring items that are big to the board, we do end up putting in there that this went to CPAC, and they voted XYZ, Planning Commission did it that way. So if that's the desire of the board to have us look at what does the voting look like, that's what we're looking for, some feedback on which direction you want us to go.
I don't think it's a bad idea to look at that, because in some cases it's creating, a quagmire. And it's not that, we want the community to have a voice. It's not about that. It's more about they could still have maybe we need some protocol in place that will help them understand how they're supposed to approach different scenarios and different situations.
Okay, Supervisor Natoli.
Yeah, I think in spirit of feedback, I would just offer that my experience has been, both as a member of this board, but certainly even prior to that, and in some of the areas where we actually formed CPACs that didn't exist prior to the early 80s, that certainly the role from time to time has evolved. In fact, when and Supervisor Peters will recall this, when we were faced with some, incorporation proposals, but also obviously discussion about community planning. We actually went, in a direction that using the CPACs as the model, but actually formed planning commissions for some of the areas in the unincorporated area. And obviously, we've taken a different tact with that experience as part of the the book on how this has evolved. I would just say that experience, my view on this is that the advisory recommendation, that's what it's been, but respectfully that voice and that forum has been very important, and certainly within District 5 and with multiple large plan areas and certainly projects of every size, shape, form, and contention at times. I've found the CPACs to be just vital and almost invaluable at times, at least from the standpoint of working, hopefully in that spirit, to seek solutions. They'll bring us recommendations, obviously, that we may see differently, and or our hearing bodies. But I think it's very, very important, and I think that early reconnaissance when they go, is important, and you don't want to have undue delay. I get that from a standpoint of applicants, whether they be large applications or small ones. But I do think that that early entree into the community, it can be valuable to staff. It certainly can be valuable in trying to, where there are points of difference, to developing hopefully approaches that either find points of compromise and or conditions that mitigate for certain aspects. But in the end of the, kind of in the end game, if you give them the authority to advise us and the county, and they use their discretion as a voice, hearing from other community members as well as applicants, then I find that very useful, and I think it's been useful for many decades in this county. And I would just also say about the appeal rights, I think that is very important. We don't see a lot of those, and yes, they can be contentious, and yes, that may be a bit bothersome to folks who may have an application that thought they could stop at the zoning administrator or the planning commission, and whoa, what do you know, you're at the board of supervisors. But again, we're the elected body for this county, and ultimately in those cases we'll make a decision. So I think standardizing, certainly the approach. I think the staff support is improved significantly. Obviously the clerk's providing staffing services, the planning support, handbooks and training, all those things are good. I think they help to streamline and make it more effective. But I, for one, don't see it as being broken. If there are instances, maybe my colleagues will share today, that indicate we need to, do something that would change the approach. But I think the basic approach of advisory recommendations early, and maybe in the case of some of these large projects where they would get a second look at it when an environmental document is done and so forth, that's important. And I think preserving the appeal rights under the conditions of the community-wide interest, we modified that a few years ago. I think that's sufficient. It's sufficiently broad, but it's also sufficiently narrow to, I think, give direction to the council and maybe remind them of what that means. But those are my comments.
Supervisor Cerna.
Okay, thank you. So, Chris, I, as you probably are well aware, have kind of a unique situation with regards to the Thomas CPAC, because first of all, it's difficult to find folks to volunteer to serve on the CPAC in the first place, and secondly, I'm concerned that as we have various very large-scale master plan proposals that begin to trickle in, as they do, that without the participation of the CPACs, is there a real propensity that if we don't have kind of the critical mass of folks volunteering, maybe we have limited ability for, because of that, to have frequent enough meetings as some of those entitlement seekers begin to ramp up their efforts, that could end up being kind of an unnecessary blockage in terms of the sequence of events that need to be exhausted as we get up, lead to planning commission, as we lead to the board of supervisors. In other words, I want to make certain that it doesn't become some kind of means to slow down the process just because we can't get the interest to serve in the first place, and perhaps having problems acquiring quorums in the second place. So I think, I don't know if other CPACs in the county necessarily have the same issue, but I think it's just kind of the nature of the beast because it's in an area that is immediately adjacent to the city of Sacramento, and I think some folks in the past have been willing to volunteer, thinking that there would be more activity than there really is. And of course, it's cyclical. It interest ebbs and flows, but I just don't want it to become a hindrance to those that rightfully deserve at least a fair, similar timeline in terms of how we process entitlements.
Yeah.
Let's see. And then I guess the second comment I have or question is there anything that staff is considering in terms of making sure that when we don't have enough folks for a quorum and there is still debate and consideration, there's presentation at these CPAC meetings, that doesn't get abused. So in other words, let's say, and I'm not accusing any CPAC or any members in particular, but I just don't want it to become morph into some way to obstruct proposals as they come forward in terms of their role to advise the Planning Commission, ultimately the Board of Supervisors, just because we can't find those quorums. I know that's I remember that at least a few times in the past where that's been part of the narrative. By the time it gets here, part of the staff report might read, well, there are multiple meetings where there was plenty of discussion, but there was no vote because we didn't have necessary people available to take that vote. And then I hear from applicants that they're going to multiple meetings and nothing happens. So it shouldn't just be a means to converse about a project. I mean, if they're going to fill out their Form 700 just like we do, and they're going to commit themselves to serving like we do and the Planning Commission does, then the expectation is that they're going to actually, have some value to the process. But I certainly want to keep my thumb on the pulse of making sure that if there's some question about that, that we be able to be nimble enough to adjust.
So in response, that has been an issue in multiple with multiple CPACs where due to a lack of a quorum, there hasn't been action that's taken on a particular project, and those projects have gone back multiple times. We have, on occasion, when it appears that the item is not controversial, just advanced the project and noted in the record for the hearing body the discussion that took place and that no formal vote was taken. That is certainly something that is on the table that we are looking to address with this amendment, because it does happen quite frequently, especially with some of the CPACs that have membership issues.
And then, of course, no, I appreciate that. And then, of course, if, depending on the disposition of individual CPAC members, again, not accusing anyone by name, but that narrative gets placed in the board letter. It's part of the presentation. We typically see a slide that says something about the nature of a vote or not. And then perhaps someone that serves on the CPAC who holds a particular position working with the neighbors to oppose a project can come to the podium and say, well, here's what happened. We didn't have enough folks for 2 or 3 meetings to actually have a vote. That should tell you something, board. It becomes part of the story of an entitlement process, and to me, that's it's kind of broken at that point because there's no substantive input. The CPAC becomes the news, so to speak, when they shouldn't.
I think, Supervisor, on the other issue that as we're going through this, that we have heard is that the timing too. The example that you gave, sometimes there's not a quorum, all good intention, let's kick it for next month, and it just goes. And when we come back to you, it will show, if you will, the narrative will show that it took us 12 months to get, I'm just picking a number, And that's part of the sensitivity we have as we look at this amendment, is to make sure that we're reflecting what really needs to be done out there.
And just one last statement about that, comment about it, is that, you know, we're facing a housing crisis, that's clear. We're producing a fraction of the units regionally that we should, and we haven't really rebounded, in my opinion, coming out of the Great Recession the way we need to for different reasons, but it's had its effect on affordability, and we're all trying to scramble to figure out what to do about it. But to the CEO's point about the time necessary to process and to you know, seek valued input from those communities where projects are proposed, I think we need to balance certainly what is fair in terms of the amount of time and effort that we give a community an opportunity to provide their input. But again, if we get the whiff of abuse, just to delay, that's when you need structural change. And so that's what I'm hearing today that this is partially about, right?
I think so, yeah, that's feedback we've gotten.
Okay, good, thanks.
Supervisor Peters.
Thank you. Well, I guess my comments would fall along similar lines. I'm not sure when we got to voting as opposed to an advisory recommendation, which we're very interested in. We want to hear what the neighbors have to say, and I know voting is a more clear way of saying it, you know, 3 to 5 or something like that, rather than more people felt this and some people felt that. But I think that needs to be looked at. I also think the process, the return is not fair, and to the applicant and really to the people who make the effort to come to the meeting. I wonder if maybe we need to go, instead of a quorum, but you know, what do we call it here? A vote of those present, you know, where the majority of the people who came to the meeting, because I have CPACs with 9 and 7. It's hard to get enough people to apply. And, you know, we have a 4-year term, and you want to get a lot of people through, as many as possible, so they learn about the processes and what happens in their community and how they can help. But it's hard when you've got, as someone described, the Form 700 and the training. It's a big commitment for a volunteer. Speaking of training, one of the things that made me comment at the budget meeting was many comments from residents who were afraid at the meeting. They were physically afraid because the meetings were getting out of control. Staff and whoever was chairing the whichever CPAC it was, and it was several CPACs, didn't have the means or the knowledge on how to proceed in an orderly fashion. And I don't think that's helpful, because particularly residents that come, and if they're scared to go to their car when they leave or scared into remaining silent, that's not what we had in mind. So I think some kind of training should be mandatory. And I think we've addressed some of those things with having a little more formal process. I don't know if that's in all the CPACs or not. I also wonder about some of the CPACs that maybe a consolidation of some or some other suggestion if you've got having trouble appointing people and getting a quorum and that kind of thing. I'd be interested in what we can determine about that. And back to the process taking so long, which I'm not sure whether that's always due to the same thing, whether it's because the CPAC doesn't agree with the project, or they didn't have a quorum, so it comes back another month and they didn't have a quorum, and it goes like that, or that there are a lot of suggestions being made to make a project fit into the neighborhood. But that process takes too long, and I agree with Supervisor Cerna. All we read in the press about what's coming from the legislature is that we're in the midst of a huge housing crisis, and when we've got projects that take 6 or 8 months to get through CPAC, and then it takes a certain amount of time to go to Planning Commission, and if it's something that has come to the board, the process is very, very long, and you could, the property owner could just miss the cycle, and we need to produce some housing for people to be able to stay in California. Let me see my other notes, training. I think that covers it. I also think one more thing, and I don't know on appeals where that fits in. If we go back to our roots or actually use the original language of where it's an advisory vote if you really have an appeal situation. I don't know what your thoughts might be on that eventually. Thank you.
Okay. Supervisor Frost.
I agree that we need to do more training, but it looks to me like the training not only with protocol in relation to how we're going to manage the meetings, but also training on the planning for that community and them understanding their community objectives and goals. And it looks to me like the CPACs aren't really exercising a big part of the really important function that they were initially intended for, which was, you tell us who you are as a community, and you help us stay consistent with the master plan. And in some of the communities, they feel like they have to hold the line on that master plan that's in place because people are coming in and trying to change the plan. And so if we were to create a situation where they're not required to necessarily take a position, in some ways it could take a lot of the pressure off those that are serving because they're there in an advisory capacity. It doesn't necessarily take away, the onus on, which is sooner or later the developer who's coming into the community with that project is going to go to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission's going to hear the advice of the community, and they're going to look at the master plan and the zoning, and they're going to have to come to terms with all of it and in one place. But it seems like the training that we offer might need to also be focused on, their community plan and what is our community plan, understanding that instead of just being subject to the whim of whichever 200 people come in that night to crawl down their throat because they're upset about a project.
Just because it's come up a couple of times, currently the training that's provided for CPAC members is limited to an annual training that we do for all members, where we invite all of the CPACs together at one training. In many cases, we have new members that are there, as well as some more seasoned members. So to the extent that there are changes made, I think staff believes that there should be some training that's targeted depending on how the amendments go. But that, of course, will come at a cost and at significant effort on the behalf of county staff to perform those trainings as well.
I know, and I think the training should be required if they're going to serve. I know it's been hard to get people to the training, but I think it is a big commitment, but if they're going to make the commitment, they should be required to come to the training in order to be on the CPAC. And the other thing I wanted to mention was the form that they fill out that we read, whenever we're looking at the agenda item, is very specifically, it talks about how many people voted and a couple little comments about the general temperature of the crowd or whatever. But that form could be changed to reflect all the comments. And there could be a secretary that's taking notes of all the comments so that when it goes to the Planning Commission, they see the comments, the developer can see the comments, and they can actually say, okay, this is on me. I can try to make them happy so it's going to go through planning smoothly, or I can just keep moving forward and hope that planning is good to go with it. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Sooner or later, they're going to have to deal with it's going to come to one place, and it shouldn't have to go through several different steps, that's what's the delay. It's a cost. It's a big cost to people.
Supervisor Peters.
Yeah, thank you. There were two other things I forgot to mention. One was I clearly remember during those hearings that Don mentioned, we have different numbers of individuals on the different CPACs, and that was meant to try it out and see which number was most efficient, worked the best. So I think that's something I'd like to hear back on too, because that was, Don, you remember that?
You're right.
Yeah.
5, 7, whatever the number was.
5, 7, 9. I've got a couple nines.
Right.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, I got some research from other cities and counties in the region, and none of them have their panels actually cast votes, yes or no. They provide input about the features of the project, but don't vote yes or no. So just background.
Okay, I won't repeat everything that was said but I agree with much of what has been said. I do think that it's a valuable function to gather information and provide that information for the decision makers. However, I don't know that that's necessary. Gathering and input and voting are two different things. I don't know that it's necessary to have a voting function. You already have, particularly on planning issues, you have the CPAC takes a vote, you got the planning commission takes a vote, and then it comes to us to take a vote, and I don't know that we need 3 votes on a project. I've heard horror stories about how delayed these projects can be. One CPAC I heard, an average delay is 9 months once they've started continuing things. That's just ridiculous. I think they should have one bite at the apple. If they can't decide, if they can't, provide their function of providing information after one meeting, then I think it moves on. It's just, it's slowing the process down. Delay. Whether it's because of a quorum or whatever the reason is, Supervisor Stern is absolutely right. I, for the life of me, I can't fill the CPACs that are in District 2. And I've begged, So I think that, perhaps where it might be appropriate, maybe, as Supervisor Peters said, maybe look at consolidating. Maybe we don't need 14. That just makes it more difficult to fill up and get quorums. But of course, it would have to be appropriate and geographically make sense and all of that, but I think it's certainly worthy of looking at. And the rest, as I said, I don't want to repeat what everybody else has said here. We do have a card from the public. Jolene Cole. I'm sorry. If you say so.
Moderately sloppy handwriting. Thank you, Board. So I actually just had a few comments and maybe just some things to think about. Oh, I'm sorry, Jackie Cole. I'm actually on the county's Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. I also work for Veritable Good Consulting, doing environmental justice work in the Sacramento area. So I'm very happy to hear, first of all, that you guys are revisiting the CPAC and their particular function. I know that during our implementation of SB 1000, at the very least, that was one of the primary mechanisms for community engagement, which was an interesting process to see because many of those community members don't know about CPACs or typically participate in those spaces. So in the absence of having a neighborhood services kind of division, that does tend to be one of the foremost interactions for community members to participate in a civic process. So I'm happy to hear that you guys are thinking about the way that that's going to continue to function in the future. I enjoyed hearing you discuss about community planning updates as well. I understand that a lot of the community plans haven't been updated in many, many decades, and so as we revisit those and start to create visions for communities to plug into, I think that it might be easier to facilitate the conversation about the way that these communities get developed. It's hard for folks to make a determination about how they want to engage when they don't have a vision to participate in. And then the last thing that I wanted to say is, consolidation, I'm all for it. The fewer meetings that I have to attend is, always a good thing. But as you're doing that, trying to make sure that you're being as representative as possible, and as we're, working on implementing environmental justice, that we encourage some of those folks that don't typically get to participate to be at the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Supervisor Frost.
I just want to mention that regarding consolidation, where I think I can see in some cases where it would be good. I know I have communities that if you try to consolidate them with someone else, it's going to be difficult. So I don't know how. Yeah, I just wanted to.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not appropriate everywhere.
Some would be more challenging than others.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Helpful?
Absolutely, thank you.
All right.
I wanted to know when it was going to come back to us, or what the process is now.
I do not have a definitive date. It's going to take us a couple months to do all the outreach, and once we get close to the date, we will communicate back to the board members.
Thank you.
Sit down. I'm sorry, what, Flo?
I believe the board needs to take a motion. There's a resolution of intention.
What?
Yes, you are correct.
I'll move.
Second. Please vote.
Unanimous vote.
And I would just suggest that on item 4, which is direct staff to initiate amendments to the county code, I think that's premature. We don't have
That's
anything
correct, yeah.
drafted.
Okay.
Okay, item 27 is a report back on general plan policy AG5. I do have a note here that we need to continue this item to April 23rd.
Yeah.
Wow.
Was it April 23rd?
April 23rd.
All right.
Is that the date? Mr. Chair, yeah, I didn't know when the date was going to be, and I know I was wanted to ask for a continuance. The information came out late on Friday. We do have agricultural representatives here, and not to get beyond the continuance request, I would ask, though, that as a part, since we have some time, that we would refer this to our Agricultural Advisory Committee between now and then. I know that Julie Jensen's in the audience, and as our representative from Farm Bureau and Central Valley Farmland Trust, but so that when we do come back, assuming there's not any further discussion today, that we've got that information. I think it's important. We have a staff recommendation and analysis, and obviously the interested parties, those in the audience and others, will have a chance to look at that before this board obviously gets a chance to weigh in further, but I would ask that we do that. We formed that committee out of the general plan, and I think this would be a good and appropriate task for them if there's no objections.
Will do.
Okay, I've got 2 cards from the public.
Sure.
Charlotte Mitchell.
Thank you, Charlotte Mitchell, California Farmland Trust, and I appreciate the continuance. That's exactly what we were hoping for, was have a dialogue with our Ag Advisory Committee that was appointed to take on such matters. So I would appreciate and honor the opportunity for this board to approve that continuance.
Thank you, Charlotte. Lindsay Leibig.
Lindsay Liebig, Sacramento County Farm Bureau. Again, also appreciate the continuance, considering the short notice of the staff report that came out, and think that the Ag Advisory Committee is the absolute appropriate place, and look forward to discussing that with that body, and then again with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Please vote.
Unanimous vote. Your next item are CEO comments.
No comments.
Comments of the board? Okay, Supervisor Frost.
I have a request regarding ADUs, and it's been going on for a couple years. I've had a lot of comments from constituents who are interested in possibly building an ADU, but they're struggling with the high fees and the fact that it's just so cost prohibitive. And so I really appreciate that the county staff went through the exercise of updating our zoning and clarifying things and making it easier for us. I'd like to request or maybe propose that I think there might be a way that the county can lower fees on ADUs without impacting the budget. And we can accomplish this by creating some templates. And so what I was hoping, even if we even went back and just selected some planning documents or some templates from ADUs that have been built over the past few years, if we could create those plans like a standardized template and then pre-approve those for planning, then people like families who have a parent who they would love to have their own place but have them nearby, or a special needs individual, they could come down to the county and they could have a choice. They could either design their own ADU custom, or they could say, we don't care that much about the design, it just needs to have certain functional features, a kitchen and a living room and a bedroom or whatever. And so they could pick out that blueprint, and they could say, okay, I'll build that one. That one's already been through planning, and so in theory that could save a lot of money on planning, and that unit could go straight to building permit or permits or whatever. So I've read a little bit about things they've done. I guess San Diego has done some things. They've actually eliminated a lot of their fees and brought their ADU costs down to almost nothing, and they're having some really great people are actually able to make that pencil out, and they're able to afford it. It's actually now affordable, and it's beginning to grow that affordable housing opportunity for families that are in the middle of something. I'm not so bold as to ask for what they're doing. They're eliminating a lot of the fees, and it's costing them money. What I'm saying is I would like for staff to go back and see if there's a way that we can create some templates or some blueprints that maybe it's not going to fit for everyone, but for some people it will be the way they can get it done. And I would also like to, just while we're on that subject, say that manufactured housing industry creates standard sizes. Our zoning doesn't necessarily fit to those standard sizes, but if the standard size can fit to one of those blueprints, then it's, in theory, they can save on the planning at the county, and they could also save at the manufactured housing plant where they're buying that unit that's just going to be delivered to their backyard and put on a permanent foundation. So I'm just asking if maybe we can kind of think out of the box and figure out, this could potentially knock, I'm estimating $7,000 to $10,000 off the planning costs associated with an ADU, and maybe it would be a start and a way that we could incentivize some affordable housing infill. And I guess my request is that staff would look at that and bring back some suggestions on how this could be done for us.
Okay.
I think there's a kernel of an idea there, but I do care what it looks like.
Well, I mean, we're creating the template. So, I mean,
But I heard you say we don't care what it looks like.
No, I said the family that's building the unit is looking for certain functions. Most seniors just need they're not so much building the Taj Mahal. I wasn't saying we don't care what it looks like. What I was saying was, I think families that can only afford this might be happy with a basic model that maybe it wasn't in the shape or the size that they wanted, but it's close.
Yeah, I think the request I'm hearing is to look at the ADUs. Is there a potential way to decrease the cost for them and whatever else goes with that, and then look at manufactured housing if there's opportunity in our zoning code to do something?
I think even in a broader, more general, just is there a way that we're currently not incentivizing these that we could be? Because I agree they should be an important part of our housing mix.
And if we have that already approved blueprint, then planning doesn't have to go through and check it, so it's not costing us money to offer that. And so that's kind of what I was thinking.
All right, we will do that and come back.
All right, anything else?
I have a closing
Yes.
memory.
Thank you.
Is it me?
Yes.
Okay. This afternoon, I would like to close in memory of a dear friend in my community, John Russell Barney, who was born December 6, 1946, and passed away on January 3rd, 2019. John was born in Plymouth, New Hampshire, near Squam Lake. If you've seen that movie on Golden Pond, that's where he lived. And he was the first generation in America who came from Canada. He grew up and went to school with his wife, Gail, and in 1966 joined the United States Marine Corps. He attended his basic training in Parris Island in 1966, and after enlistment, received his draft notice for the Army, which the Army didn't get him because he'd already applied to go to he was already accepted into the Marines. He was assigned to Camp Pendleton which is a U.S. Marine Corps base in Southern California, where he met up with Gail once again. She was attending college there in Southern California, and they married at Pendleton on January 5, 1967. In February 1967 to March 1968, he was a combat veteran in Vietnam. In 1969, after the Marines, they lived in North Carolina, and John worked as a civil service mechanic for the Air Force. In 1978, they moved to Sacramento area, and he worked at McClellan Air Force Base. John retired after 20 years. He was a Mason, and he was a member of the American Legion Post 637 in Citrus Heights for 22 years. During his service with the American Legion, he was the post historian and a member of the executive board. He was a guy that was always behind the camera. He took a lot of the pictures of everyone, and so we didn't have a whole lot of pictures of him. He was a father of 2 children, a daughter Joanne and son John Jr., grandfather of 4, and great-grandfather of 3. John was a loyal friend. He was relatively quiet, but I remember every now and then he would come up to me and whisper in my ear and give me feedback regarding how he felt about things. He was a patriot. His life was dedicated to his country. He was very close to his children and grandchildren, and his family was everything to him. We all truly miss you, John. May you rest in eternal peace.
Thank you. And we will close in the memory of John Russell Barney.